On this special episode of Movie Geeks United, we commemorate the 40th anniversary of the release of Steven Spielberg's iconic science fiction masterpiece, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. We are welcoming on our show Ray Morton, author of the excellent book on the making of Close Encounters, which is one of the most detailed accounts of the production of a Hollywood film in the pre-CGI days that I've had the pleasure to read. Ray is also the author of another book that I would highly recommend, King Kong, The History of a Movie Icon from Fay Wray to Peter Jackson. So, thanks for coming on our show. I'm Adam
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, you're quite welcome. I just wanted to introduce myself because I don't even I'm Adam Long, the home video correspondent, who normally is serving in that capacity. But we are just, like I said, thrilled to have you on because I'm sure I was thinking you're probably one of the most knowledgeable people on this subject, on the making of having interviewed all these people.
Well, tried to be thorough. So I hope I have some useful information, you know.
Well, first off, I was just going to ask you, what is your first encounter with Close Encounters of the Third Kind?
Right. Well, it's interesting. I knew about it before it was coming. I was a definite, very young movie geek in my day. And I used to get this magazine. I don't think it's even published anymore, but it was called Monthly Film Bulletin. And it was the magazine that theater owners used to get. And they would have very advanced information on films coming out that were in production. And one time I got an issue, and I opened it up, and it had an insert, and it was announcing the new film from the director of Jaws. And I had really liked Jaws. I don't know that I completely understood all how things fit together in those days because I was pretty young, but I remember it had the great tagline, Close Encounters of the First Kind, sighting of a UFO, second kind, evidence, and third kind, contact. And I thought that was really interesting, and I just started following it, and they announced that Francois Truffaut was going to be in it, and I don't think I'd even seen the Truffaut film at that time, but I knew what the name meant. So I was really interested in this movie. And then about a month or two before it came out, there was a giant cover story on Newsweek all about the movie. Totally grabbed my attention. And I lived in the suburbs of Connecticut at that time, so movies didn't open there until they went wide. We didn't get exclusive or, limited release things. So the movie opened in November of 1977, and I was chomping at the bit because I wanted to see this movie so badly. And then it finally came around in December. I went on a Wednesday night. I took my two sisters. I made my mom drop us off. We went inside. I watched this film. I didn't really know what to expect, even though I had been prepping myself, and I was so totally blown away. I was transported, actually, by the last 30 minutes of the movie. I'd never seen a film that combined visuals and music and sound and really no dialogue, and it told this incredible, complete story all its own. And at the end of the movie, I was so transfixed that I just sat there staring at the screen as the end credits rolled. And I actually just sat there after they stopped rolling because I was just so taken with this film. My sister finally turned to me and said, "Let's go. We got to leave now." And that woke me up, and I went with it. A week later, I went back. I said, I'm going to love this movie again, but I will never be transported in the same way, which is a shame. And darn, it happened again. I had the same feeling, and I ended up just sitting and staring and really taking the movie in. I've seen it probably 100 times since. That's never happened again, but I really treasure those two experiences, seeing the film.
Yeah, that's in our town, and I'm from North Carolina and grew up in a small North Carolina town. We didn't get it until February of 1978, and I had pretty much I had pretty much the same experience I think you did. My father took me to see it, and it was something that he was excited about, and so it was just the two of us, father and son, and it was just amazing. And I think the two films from that year that everybody talks about, of course, are Star Wars and and Close Encounters, even though Annie Hall won Best Picture.
Right. What? I've never heard of that movie.
Never heard of it.
Yeah,
and I love Annie Hall, I do. But as far as sci-fi, I always thought it was interesting how people are always divided into two camps: those who love Star Wars and those who love Close Encounters. And I like Star Wars a lot, but I love Close Encounters, which it sounds like you're coming from that same wheelhouse.
Yeah, pretty much. It's funny because Star Wars actually, I think it opened in May of '77. For whatever reason, it did not come around to our area until late August of that year. So I didn't end up seeing. I saw it. I guess what I'm getting at is I saw both movies fairly close together within only a few months. And I think Star Wars is a terrific movie, and I really liked it. Although, honestly, I think I really only fell in love with the whole Star Wars phenomenon when the second one came out, because suddenly it had a whole other dimension. But I really liked Star Wars, but I was always a Close Encounters guy. I thought it was the better movie at the time. I still think, I think the effects accomplishments in Star Wars are spectacular, but there's something about those Douglas Trumbull visual effects in Close Encounters that I think still hold up and are so luminous. And you add that to the cinematography of Vilmos Zsigmond. And as I said, I like Star Wars. I was transported by Close Encounters.
Totally agree. I feel exactly the same way. And I was curious about your research process, because this is a very thoroughly researched book. And I want to go ahead and reiterate the title of the book for any of our listeners there, in case I didn't earlier. It's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, The Making of Steven Spielberg's Classic Film. And so I just wanted to get a little bit about your research process, because it looks like you've interviewed pretty much at the time that it was written, everybody who was around except maybe Spielberg.
Yeah, Steven was the elusive target in that one. Although his office was really nice, he was the first person I contacted, because it wasn't an official sanctioned book. Like Columbia didn't go for it, not that we didn't ask them to, but it wasn't an authorized book. So I wanted to make sure that Spielberg was aware of what I was doing. Of course, I really wanted to talk to him. So he was the first letter I sent, and I got a really nice response from his assistant. And what she basically told me was that at that point in time, he had talked about the movie all he wanted to talk about it. And they directed me towards certain specific interviews that he had done that according to the assistant, that was Spielberg's, those were the best answers he could give. And they said, if you use those answers, that's really what he has to say about the film. And they wished me luck with it. And what I'm grateful for is they didn't stand in the way of it, because they could have, and it certainly I would have understood if he had done that. But they were very complimentary and encouraging about going ahead. He just did not want to participate at that point. Though I did later send them a copy of the finished book, and I got a nice note from the assistant saying that he really appreciated the work that I had done. So I'm assuming he read it. I hope he did. I don't know. But then after that, I went through the credits, and I made a list of every single person, that was in the credits. And then at that point, IMDb was kind of up and running, so there are sometimes names that aren't in the credits. And I just started contacting everybody that I could. And the key first interview I had was with Douglas Trumbull. He was very responsive, and I sat down with him at a hotel in Los Angeles he gave me an hour, but we ended up being there about 4 hours, which was wonderful. And he took me through everything, and then he put me in touch with his partner on the film, Richard Urasich. And Richard Urasich turned out to be just the most wonderful resource. He's a brilliant font of information and knowledge about visual effects, especially the way they were made back then. And he was really the day-to-day nuts and bolts guy on Close Encounters. Trumbull was the visionary and would come up with the big ideas and develop the systems and things. But Urasich was a cameraman, and he's the one who really got the day-to-day stuff going. So he sat down with me and he was so generous with his time. He gave me a general interview. We spent a couple of hours talking, and then he basically said, send him anything that I needed. So everything with the special effects section, I ran by him. I showed him rough drafts of things. He gave me input. He thought, you've got it right there. That you can vote on. I want you to emphasize this more. This isn't so important. And that was a real big help because I really worked on the special effects section first because it was going to be the hardest thing. I'm not a gearhead. I don't understand. I understand generally technology, but these guys have a knowledge. I mean, they're magicians. The guys who made these visual effects, they're nuts and bolts cameramen, but in the end they create just this wonderful imagery. And Richard Jurisic really guided the whole visual effects section. And I wanted him to be happy with it because he's a stickler for detail and accuracy, and he doesn't have a lot of patience for accounts that are sloppy or poorly researched and things. And I'm the same way, so I just wanted him to be pleased with it. And he really helped me a lot. And he put me in touch with all sorts of folks, and he also made sure that I mentioned all sorts of people who never get mentioned in these things, and I was really happy to do that and pleased to do that. And that was the first part of the project. And then I did a lot of research at the Academy Library, and there were a bunch of other places where I went, the American Film Institute, and I got a lot of background information from there. And then I met with Joe Alves, who was the production designer. And Joe's like Richard Jurisic. He's a walking font of the entire history of the project, and he just remembered every detail. And he met with me a few times. We had a general interview, and then he met with me a couple times to go over things. So I felt like I had these two really great resources. And then I got in touch gradually with many other people. I sat down with Michael Phillips, the producer, and again, he had great insight into the early parts, the development of the project. He didn't actually work on the movie day to day when it was in production. His ex-wife, Julia, did, and she's passed away, so I wasn't able to talk to her. But I did talk to a lot of the production people who were able to fill me in on things. So yeah, it was, and it took about a year. The research took about a year, and then the writing took a bunch of months more, I think.
Yeah, I was noting how meticulously researched it was. I was just curious about how that all came together. So, yeah, that's very, very interesting because I was surprised at how big of a role that Richard Jurisic plays in the book.
Yes.
He's mentioned so many times, and I just didn't. I was aware of Joe Alves' contribution, obviously,
yes,
because he's pretty well known to people who are movie geeks like myself, but wasn't.
Me too.
But wasn't as familiar with Jurisic, and so that was. I'm glad you illuminated his contributions in the book. I just wanted to maybe talk a little bit about the origins of the film, because we all know that Spielberg was coming off of his huge success with Jaws, in spite of the fact that it was such a trying production, yes, physically and otherwise. And I know I was fascinated when I read your book that one of the projects that he was actually thinking about pursuing right before Jaws and possibly after was a biopic of the life of the man who invented the toilet. It was called. There was a script called "Flushed with Pride."
Flushed with Pride, the story of Thomas Crapper, the inventor of the toilet. Yes.
I read that and I laughed out loud. I have to tell you that.
He worked on that with Gloria Katz and Werlin Height, the writers of American Graffiti, of all things. So, yeah.
So that was interesting. He could have. I'm glad he didn't pursue that project and went with Close Encounters instead. Let's just put it that way. So,
well, his agent told him when he proposed that movie to his agent said, "If this is the kind of movie you want to make, I don't want to be your agent anymore." That was very funny.
Great advice.
Yes.
So,
well, the origins of the project, they are often misreported, as Spielberg, when he was in his teens, made a feature-length Super 8 movie called Firelight, which he filmed with all of his friends from high school, and he put it together and he did homemade visual effects. And the ambitious fellow that he was, even at that age, he rented a theater in his hometown in Arizona, and they had a big premiere. They even had Klieg lights, apparently, which they got, I think, from a car dealer. So he made this movie, which was about UFOs, and it was basically about lights seen in the sky, and then all sorts of monster-y type stuff starts happening. And it is often misreported that Close Encounters is a remake of that childhood film, and it is not. The Close Encounters, obviously he was interested in UFOs, and he was a young man when the UFO craze was happening in America, which was in the mid and late 1950s. So it was a subject that very much interested him. But the movie began essentially as a one-line pitch. He said he wanted to do a movie about UFOs and Watergate. And the original idea was he wanted to do a story about Project Blue Book, and he wanted to create a conspiracy thriller in which Project Blue Book was covering up the truth about UFOs, because that was a fairly common conspiracy theory in the late 60s and early 70s. And he came up with the idea initially around 1973. And he started working with Julia Phillips and Michael Phillips, and they were coming off The Sting. So the three of them joined forces. They pitched the project to a couple of studios. Alan Ladd Jr. at Fox was very interested, but Julia and Michael wanted to use Paul Schrader to write the screenplay. And Schrader had just begun making a name for himself, and Alan Ladd Jr., who was running Fox, did not want Schrader to write the script. He felt that Schrader was too intense and too humorless to write what they were hoping was going to be, a more general entertainment. The Phillipses and Spielberg wanted to stick with Schrader, so they moved away from Fox and ended up making a deal with David Beagleman at Columbia. This is all around 1973, early 1974. They hired Schrader to write the screenplay, and he turned in, it's very famously, he turned in a script that was more Paul Schrader than it was Steven Spielberg. It was a story about a Project Blue Book officer who investigated UFOs, and his job was to debunk them and tell people they were imagining things. And then one night he has a close encounter on the road with a UFO, and after that he becomes a believer. They based it very much on the St. Paul story. And then after that, he spends years and years trying to prove UFOs are real, and in the end he travels to a landing site and finally discovers that they are real and gets on the ship and goes away. But it's a very serious script. It's humorless, and it's much, the close encounter in the end of the movie isn't physical, it's mental. He has like a psychic encounter in his own mind. Spielberg hated the script. He said, this isn't what I want to do. So they started over with a writer named John Hill, and he wrote them the original idea, a much more mainstream thriller about a cover-up of the UFO phenomenon and then the discovery at the end that it's real. By the time he finished the script, Spielberg was already in the middle of Jaws and didn't really have a lot of time to focus. But he and the Phillipses decided they no longer wanted to do a thriller. They wanted to do something with more joy and more spirit, and the thriller idea just started to bore them. They felt they weren't getting what they wanted out of the material. So after Jaws was over, Spielberg essentially started over again. He wrote an entirely new script by himself that is pretty much, a lot got changed, but the movie that we know is in that script. It's basically the story that you saw. A telephone lineman, or a power company lineman, has a close encounters, becomes obsessed, and in the end follows it through to a final meeting. And it's the average man as opposed to military man. That was very important to Spielberg, and sort of that whole suburban life aspect of the movie that was not in any of the earlier scripts. From there, they got a yellow light from David Beagleman. They began to actively develop the movie, and after that, Spielberg's friends, Matthew Robbins and Hal Barwood, came in and did some rewrites. Jerry Belson did some rewrites. David Giler supposedly did some rewrites. And by the time they were shooting, and then the most wonderful thing is as they were shooting, Spielberg improvised entire sections of the story on the set. So some of the most important parts of the movie were made up on the spot, which I think is just a tribute to how his imagination just kept going and going and going. But anyway, that's how it got started.
Yeah, I found that to be fascinating. Several of the things you mentioned there. When I read your book, and I saw that Jerry Belson was one of the
Yes.
screenwriters.
Yes.
And that was shocking because people like myself, we know him primarily for having partnered up with Gary Marshall for The Odd Couple and
Yes.
for his writing chores on The End, the 1978 Burt Reynolds film. We don't think of him as that guy who co-wrote or wrote a draft of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and then the Paul Schrader thing is quite interesting too, because he is not known for his humor, and especially as evidenced by Taxi Driver or Raging Bull or numerous other. That's not his forte. So,
no.
But yeah, that was fascinating to read about the early screenplay drafts. As far as the pre-production on the film and getting a green light, one of the things that fascinated me a lot, and I'll have to get you to talk about this, was the way the investors wanted to get a tax write-off in 1975 before they actually had any actors cast. So I was going to get you to kind of shed a little light on that story, if you could.
There was. In the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of early 80s, a lot of Hollywood, there was a lot of tax shelter stuff going on. They were able to write off considerable amounts of production costs if you filmed under certain conditions in certain ways. And I'm not a tax person. I don't understand the ins and outs of it. But essentially, if they could film something from the movie in the year 1975, then they could write off a certain amount of the percentages and save themselves a lot of money. And Columbia Pictures famously was in a lot of trouble in those days. Financially, they had almost gone under a couple of years early. So the idea to save any kind of money was very attractive to them. And so they had to do some sort of filming in the fiscal year of 1975. Well, Jaws had taken up most of 1975 for Spielberg. The film came out in June, and he'd been doing publicity for it. It was a big hit, and he was all over the place. And he had been working on the script for Close Encounters, but it hadn't really come together. I mean, his version of it. It was still in the very early days, but Columbia basically said, you have to film something by the end of the year. And so what they ended up deciding to do is one of the key scenes in his original concept, and then when Barwood and Robbins were working on it, it was expanded, was the air traffic control scene, which was originally the opening of the movie. And if you see the movie now, there's a wonderful wipe from the radar scope where it goes from black and then it wipes onto the image of the radar scope. That was originally how they were going to come out of the title. Was the screen was going to wipe and you were going to come into this radar scope. Anyway, that was the only scene that didn't involve principal cast, didn't require a lot of production design because they were going to film in an actual air traffic control facility, which is actually, I believe, in Lancaster, the Lancaster Palmdale Air Traffic Control Center out here in California. And so that was the one place they could get that was germane to the movie, but that didn't require a whole lot of extra preparation. So they went out there in, I believe it was November of 1975, and they basically, that was the first thing shot in Close Encounters. And it's one of my absolute favorite scenes in the movie because it's a terrific scene no matter what, but it's also a scene that shows you what a talented film director Steven Spielberg is, because he makes drama out of slightly changing the focus on faces of people talking, on the whole group of air traffic controllers is talking. He's just subtly changing the focus to direct your attention. This guy was, what was he, 27, 28, 29 when he did this. It's the most amazing thing. But anyway, I'm getting long-winded. That was what they filmed in the end of '75. The rest of the movie didn't start shooting until the summer of 1976.
Yeah, I found that to be fascinating. That they would that they were so adamant about getting something in the can that they before they'd even cast anybody or anything. That was just that was fascinating. But if memory serves, the next thing they did was to getting the green light was an interesting story in your book too, which came down to I believe the tarp that they were going to to erect. That's a good story too.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Originally the deal was, because Columbia was in such financial straits, and because Spielberg had just spent almost a year on the water in Massachusetts filming Jaws, none of them wanted to do a location movie. So the idea was they were going to maybe travel to a mountain, and it took them a while to find Devil's Tower. They always knew they were going to go to a mountain location, but Devil's Tower itself came later. But otherwise, the idea was to film all the suburban stuff on the back lot at the Burbank Studios in Burbank, and then to film the actual encounter. Joe Alves knew from the very beginning that they needed to do an indoor set. So that was always going to be the biggest piece of the budget and the biggest piece of the construction and everything. But originally they were going to do it on 2 stages at the Burbank Studios, now the Warner Brothers Studios. And there were 2 stages that had a door in between them that you could open up. And the idea was, well, we'll use that amount of space. It was the stage they filmed Camelot on back in the late 60s. They built that giant set there. And as they were working on the design, Al started to realize that they needed a much bigger space than the soundstage allotted. And that created a lot of tension with the front office, because now they're talking about going off the lot. So suddenly they're talking about not being in a controlled situation, and that what tends to happen in movies is that means the budget starts to go up. And Alves had created this idea for a set that was going to cost millions of dollars just by itself. The original number that they pitched Columbia back at the start of the project was like $3 million. I think the set ended up costing $3 million or something like that. And they ended up finding an abandoned air base in Mobile, Alabama, and they decided that it had 2 hangars that could be opened up against each other, and that was big enough for what they wanted to do. So they decided they were going to build it there, and then they decided they would film all the suburban stuff around Mobile. It's supposed to be Indiana, but it's actually Alabama. And now, of course, the budget's starting to go up. Columbia is getting nervous. And actually the tarp came later, but it was that facility that made them decide that they wanted to film off the lot. And what ended up doing it for them was every time they complained to Spielberg and Alves, I don't think Spielberg did this quite as flamboyantly as I'm going to describe it, but as he quoted himself, he waved Jaws grosses in their face. and at a certain point, Columbia thought, okay, we're just going to have to go with this. And that's really how it got going.
Yes, I remember there was a piece of cloth that they had to get made in a certain amount of time. And they basically, that's a good story. If you could tell that. Oh,
I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to the tarp later.
No, that's okay. No, that's.
Yeah, Joe Alves needed to wrap the entire set in this black, I believe it was like a velvet cloth, and you needed so much of this to wrap this gigantic set. That's right. He had to order it on a certain day in order for it to be ready when they were going to film. So I had to go to Columbia and say, "Are you guys making the movie or not?" and they're like, "All right, we're going to make the movie." And yeah, you're right. That's exactly what got it going.
That was just such a great story that a piece of cloth led to them making the decision to greenlight it.
Oh yeah.
It's awesome. So yeah, the production. I know they started early. The early scenes with the actors was done at the actual location in Wyoming, and I found it interesting that they all had to stay in just a very small hotel room. Most of them chose to, except for Spielberg and some of the more key people on the production who had trailers. But I thought it was interesting that you said in the book that Truffaut actually opted to stay in one of the hotel rooms in one of these small hotels.
Yeah.
And
well, they stayed in a motel, and I believe it was quite a ways away because Devil's Tower is pretty remote. I went up there a few years ago. It's beautiful. But it's very remote. And now there's a campground and a little motel there, but that was not there in 1976. So the crew, everybody stayed at some hotel. It was like about an hour away, I think, something like that. And Spielberg didn't want to make that drive every day, so he and Richard Dreyfuss and I believe Melinda Dillon, they had trailers parked at Devil's Tower, right at the foot, and they just stayed out there. And of course, they had amenities; they had a cook and everything. They weren't roughing it that much, but that way they didn't have to make the 2-hour drive every day. And I think Truffaut stayed out one night, and he was like, "That's enough," and then he went back to the hotel. He wasn't going to stay out in the American wilderness with prairie dogs. I don't think.
That was just the sight of him staying at this small hotel in rural Wyoming. I don't know, it just kind of made me laugh.
Well, Joe Alves has a very funny story about that. He said that, he was a giant Truffaut fan, and he so wanted to impress Francois. And he said he thought Francois would be so impressed with this giant set that he built inside this airplane hangar in Mobile, Alabama. And he said that Truffaut just kept looking at it. He never said anything. And then they had to do a quick knock-together set. There's a scene where Melinda Dillon's character is searching for her son, and it's the scene where she sees Devil's Tower on the TV set, and she's supposed to be in a motel somewhere in the Southwest. Joe Alves said he slapped together like 2 walls. They put a neon sign outside to make it look like a motel, and he put it up in about 2 days. They shot it in about 20 minutes, and then they knocked it down. He said when Truffaut walked on, he said, "This is a wonderful set." And he goes, so he liked this dumb little motel room set, but he had nothing to say about the airplane hangar. And Al said years later what he realized is in France, the only thing they would ever have built was a motel room. In France, they don't make movies where they build giant outdoor sets inside a hangar. So Truffaut had no frame of reference for it. But he had a frame of reference for a small hotel room set. So he just praised Joe Alves to the sky for this little motel thing he knocked together in 2 days. So.
That is a great story. That's great. Yeah. Well, I'll just talk a little bit about and if you've got some more time here. I know we said 30 minutes, but if you've got a few more minutes, just talk a little bit about the production aspect of it while they were in Mobile, Alabama. I know it was summer of '76, and it was really kind of difficult physically for some of the actors and with the heat and all that. So I thought I'd get you to talk a little bit about that, because that's where they moved, I believe, after the Wyoming shooting portion of the film.
Right, yeah. Joe Alves had an interesting statement. He said that about 1/3 of the movie takes place on the set in Mobile, but it was where they spent about 60% of their shooting time. So, yeah, they started up in Wyoming at Devil's Tower and all those areas around there, and then they went to Mobile, and they basically shot on this big set in about 3 different concentrated periods of time, and then in between, while they were rearranging things, because they had to shoot the set before the Mothership arrived, and then they had to shoot the set after it arrived, which required them to put the bottom half of the Mothership, build it on the set. So they had a break. So essentially they shot a bunch of stuff on the stage at Mobile, and then they went out around in the area. All of Roy Neary's suburban home stuff was done in an actual suburban tract in Mobile. Again, it's supposed to be Indiana, but it's in Mobile. Joe Alves found it, and it's a real house that they filmed in it. They knocked out walls. They had to do all sorts of things, but that was done there. And actually, all of this, where Richard Dreyfuss is looking for Melinda Dillon at the train station, which is supposed to be Wyoming, that was also done in Alabama. And all of the stuff at Jillian's house was also done in Alabama. So all of that stuff that's supposed to be all around the country was all filmed around the same area where this airplane hangar was. The airplane hangar, the one stage they had what they called the Box Canyon set. That's the landing site for the mothership in the end of the movie, and that's where they needed that backing that you're referring to. And then the second one, they had workshops, but they also built what was called Crescendo Summit. That's the piece of road where Richard Dreyfuss and Melinda Dillon first see the UFOs when they come around the corner. That was an indoor set that was constructed inside the second hangar, and a lot of footage was done there, like 3 major sequences are done there. So, yeah, and it was very hot. Mobile is a hot place, and it's a humid place. It was so humid that every so often the set would make its own rain. Clouds, the humidity would collect at the top of the airplane hangar, and it would start to rain on everybody. Dreyfuss said it was so hot, he went up in the rafters once to look at, they drew out camera angles from up in the rafters. He went up to look at it, and he saw grips, he said, like dropping like flies because it was so hot up in the upper reaches of the airplane hangar. And someone ended up getting, they had a daily popsicle run. Everybody got a popsicle because that was the way they would cool themselves down while they were filming. So.
Yeah, that was fascinating too. And I also read, I remember seeing in your book that it was actually so humid in there that grass actually started growing at one point. I think.
Yes. They brought in dirt to the Crescendo Summit set. Had actual dirt piled on top of it. It was the steel structure and then plaster and things, but they trucked in dirt, and I believe they also trucked in some dirt for the hillside around the big set. And yes, it was so hot and had the humidity and it had the rain, so actual grass did start to grow on the set, which does not usually happen. So that was pretty amazing,
That was pretty spectacular detail that I was unaware of until I read it in your book there. And so we'll talk a little bit about the special effects that Trumbull was. I think he was working simultaneously on a lot of the effects while they were shooting in Mobile. And he had if memory serves, he had a crew round the clock, 7 days a week, and all that.
That came a little later.
Okay.
He was on set for most of the shooting. They originally had a different plan. The visual effects ended up being done the way they were done, which I'll talk about in a minute. But originally the idea was they wanted to produce a lot of the effects ahead of time. Trumbull was a big fan of the front screen projection process. And his idea was to do the effects and then put the actors on the set, build the set in front of a giant front screen projection screen, and then do it all without having to do optical compositing later. That ended up not working because front projection turned out to be really, really hard to get to perfect. But Trumbull was there, and he was the one. There was an original idea. This was back in the gritty 70s when everybody wanted things to look as real as possible. The original plan was they were going to build lights into the set of the landing strip and then use those lights to essentially light the scene. But they needed so much light for the visual effects, and the set was so big that they ended up doing a lot of artificial lighting that they had not originally planned to do. And Vilmos Zsigmond was in charge of the cinematography, and he ended up getting in trouble because he was being blamed for all the time it took to light the set, even though he goes, the original plan, which he did not come up with, was to not light the set. But Doug Trumbull was the guy who said, you guys are going to need way more light so that they could shoot in 65 millimeter, because all the visual effects were done in 65 millimeter, and that required a tremendous amount of light to get a good image. So Trumbull was really responsible for sort of restructuring the way the lighting was going to be done on the stage. And they filmed a couple of test things, but really when the movie was over, they didn't have to start from scratch, but they had to kind of restart the visual effects process. And the filming ended at the end of the summer of 1976, and then there were some reshoots or additional shooting at the end of the year. But essentially, from the end of the summer until the release a year and several months later, Trumbull and his team were working not necessarily around the clock. They got there at the end of the schedule, but they were working every day, all day on just creating these effects. It was all done in a little workshop building down in Marina del Rey, California. I've been down there a few times. From the outside, it's the most boring place in the world. It's just a little building. They built a smoke room so that they could film the UFOs with all the glowing lights. You need smoke to do that. They had another stage where they shot matte paintings, and they had an optical printer, and they just spent months shooting all the different pieces, combining them. Things wouldn't work right. They'd redo it. They'd take it apart. They just worked tremendously hard to perfect what I think are still effects that have never been equaled as far as I'm concerned. Just gorgeous pieces of work, you know.
I totally agree, and the amount of detail is amazing. I just revisited the film again just a couple of nights ago just to be up to speed here, and I was amazed to find out that they created a lot of the stars that you see in the sky. That was done by Trumbull, which I always assumed, well, they just had a nice starlit night, and they went out and shot it, and I was wrong.
Yeah, well, you can do it probably now, but in those days you couldn't photograph stars. You needed too much light. Mm-hmm. So anytime you see stars in that movie, they're not actual stars. They were mostly created by a wonderfully talented guy named Robert Swarth, who was an award-winning animator, and he came to work with Trumbull on different projects, and he was in charge of creating the starscapes and then putting them into the shots. They did a lot of that stuff, what they call first generation, where they'd film a take and then they wouldn't develop it, and they'd have a little matte line blocking out the place where the stars were, and then they would create these star fields on an animation stand and then re-expose the film now with a matte blocking the original photography so that they call it burning in, but they could burn the stars into the original negative. And in visual effects in those days, getting things in the original negative was the holy grail, because the more you're on the original negative, the clearer and more detailed the image is. If you have to do a lot of reprinting and optical printing, the image starts to degrade over time. And so they did a lot of these stars right onto the original 65 millimeter negatives. And the special effects were all shot in 65 millimeter because it's a much bigger image surface. And the idea was when those images were shrunk down, they wouldn't look grainy or faded the way visual effects could sometimes look, because they were going down a generation from an overly detailed image to begin with, so the reduction would match the original 35 millimeter image. That's one of the reasons the effects look so good. But the star fields, what Bob Swarth said, he said that, because I told him once, I said, I'm just so in awe, the stars are beautiful. He goes, you should have seen what they look like in the original 65 millimeter. Apparently, in the original tape, they were even more breathtaking. I couldn't imagine that, but he said he's always a little disappointed in the actual release. So, yeah.
Oh, that's great. I was, it's amazing to me to think that there's, and I think if I remember correctly, that there was many as 15 separate pieces of film in some shots. As 15 separate things that have been shot at different times that were, layered and matted together, and it looks so seamless. It's amazing.
That was the genius of Doug Trumbull and Richard Urasich, and their whole team. It was called the Future General Company, which I love that. And everyone knows ILM, but I love Future General. I think it's a wonderful name for an effects company. But they were masters at detail. They were masters at. They were all Richard Jurisic said once is the difference between modern special effects with computers and the ones they did. He said everything we did was photography-based. Now, of course, everything is computer-based. And he said the thing with photography is it was all photographic processing. You had to understand photography. You had to understand math, do all the formulas. You had to understand how to apportion the frames and things. But they were really good at paying attention to those details, so they could take 15 different elements, put them together. It was a laborious process, and it didn't always work the first or second or even the fifth time. They had to do a lot of, finessing. But when the images were done, as far as I'm concerned, there's not a dud in that batch. There's not really one effect you can point to where you can say, boy, that doesn't work. They're all just really technically perfect,
This is true. I feel exactly the same way. And so we'll talk a little bit about the post-production. I know that they kept having to reshoot scenes that they had not had the chance to or just weren't able to shoot for whatever reason during the actual production. Or Spielberg kept getting new ideas. I know that right up until the last minute. So that was another thing. So we could talk a little bit about that.
Someone said they had to pry the movie out of his hands to finally release it because Spielberg was great at just building on things. And in the actual movie itself, the one thing I love is everything with those wonderful hand signs where they teach the people hand signs, and then in the end the little alien gives you the hand sign. All of that was improvised. None of that was in any of the scripts. They made that stuff up on the spot, and it's such a wonderfully important part of the movie and integral that I just think that's amazing. And he was doing things like that all the time. But the two major reshoots they did, or not reshoots, additional shoots, they made the bulk of the movie in the summer of 1976 in Wyoming and Mobile. Then they took it back and Spielberg started editing it. And then at a certain point, he had always had a scene in the script where the Truffaut's team came upon a bunch of airplanes that had been taken in World War II and then returned, and originally in the middle of the jungle. And the idea was Truffaut was going to paddle up the Amazon, and he was going to find these planes in the middle of a hacked out part of the jungle. They didn't have enough money to shoot that, and Columbia just said, you guys have spent too much money, we're not going to shoot that. And Spielberg kept asking them to, so finally they agreed to do that. So he went, was actually out in the desert in California, outside of Los Angeles, where they created that junkyard set supposedly in Mexico. And so they allowed him to shoot that. That was a little bit later in 1976. He'd always wanted to do a scene where they discovered the musical sounds, and there were different ideas for that, but eventually he got the idea that he wanted to set it in India, and Columbia approved that because they had money. Currency in those days, foreign currency, couldn't be taken out of India. So Columbia had all this money in banks over there from the movies they had shown in India that they couldn't take out. So they had to do something with it. So that financed the India shoot. They went over there, and that's where you got that wonderful scene where they hear the sounds for the first time, the humans. And then the final bit of work they shot, when Spielberg put the entire movie together, there was a lot of confusion over the story didn't quite make sense. The Francois Truffaut part of the story was very vague. You saw these guys running around, but you never really understood exactly what they were up to. And it was kind of explained at the end, we created this fake, gas thing, and we're really plotting to build this landing strip at Devil's Tower. But in the original cut, none of that was explained. So when they looked at it, they realized that there was a lot that needed to kind of be laid out. So what they did is they brought in Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins to write a couple of extra scenes, and then they did a lot of that filming right at the end of 1976. So those scenes were, there's the scene where the people are in the radio telescope and they essentially discover the coordinates for Devil's Tower. That was filmed then. And then all of the stuff in the warehouse where they're, You hear the guys plotting, like, we need to come up with something that's going to get everybody out of the area. That scene was an additional scene. Both of those scenes were shot at the Burbank studios. The scene where the guys get on the bus to actually leave is the mill at Burbank Studios, which is now Warner Brothers, but that's where they build all the sets. They just use that as a warehouse. So those scenes were all shot to clarify the story. And the interesting part about that is Bob Balaban's entire job in the movie changed. Originally, he was just a translator working for Francois Truffaut. When they filmed these new scenes where they needed to find the coordinates of Devil's Tower to explain to the audience why they were going to Devil's Tower, they suddenly changed his job. Now he was a cartographer who could read maps, who also happened to speak French and was hired to be Truffaut's translator. And then they filmed the introduction of that when they did the Mexican desert sequence. I just think it's hysterical that a year after he was done filming, his entire park became a completely different park. And he has a good sense of humor about that in his own book. So yeah, a lot of that was all done. And then they did a big stunt where the police car goes flying through the air. That was, I think, one of the last things shot, and that was filmed down in Long Beach, California. All of this was in the late winter, late 1976, early 1977.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Yeah, and you, speaking of the flying police car, another great detail was that I was reading in your book about the actual chase where the police cars are chasing the UFOs, and I meant to mention this earlier, that they did this. They got these cars up to speed and were going at such a high rate of speed inside these airplane hangars in Mobile, Alabama.
Well, that chase was filmed all over the place, which is kind of funny. Yeah, the actual scenes where they come around the corner, because there's that wonderful scene where the UFOs first appear to Richard Dreyfuss and Melinda Dillon, and then seconds later the police cars come around. That was all filmed in the hangar. So they had to kind of back up the other end of the hangar, and they all had to get up to speed and come roaring around that curve and not go flying off the set, because it was really just a set. It wasn't the most sturdy thing in the world. So you're driving two heavy police cars. It was a little gutsy, I think. But yeah, that was all done in Mobile, and then the rest of it was filmed in California months afterwards. So it's and then of course there's that great shot where the police cars all park and policemen get out and you see the UFOs flying off in the distance. That's actually the only completed front projection shot in the entire movie. That was how they were originally going to do everything. That was all done in Mobile also.
Oh, that's fascinating. It really is. And it looks so wonderful. I guess thanks to Michael Kahn's great editing, for one thing. And this was the first film that he collaborated with Spielberg on. Originally, I think Verner Fields was his cutter for Jaws, and she departed company, and we really don't know why.
Yeah, it's a little. Well, after Jaws, she was made an executive at Universal. She actually became a production executive. And Spielberg asked for her to come work on Close Encounters because they had done such great work together on Jaws. But then somewhere along the line, she was actually announced when the original production announcement, Verner Fields was supposed to cut. The rumor has always been that when Jaws came out, Jaws was a very troubled production, and a lot of it was blamed on Spielberg. This is before it came out, because they're like, well, you put a 27-year-old kid in charge of a movie, of course you're going to have all this stuff. And when the movie turned out to be a terrific movie, a lot of people gave credit to Verner Fields, and Verner did a wonderful job cutting that film. It's a wonderfully edited movie. But there became this kind of rumor that she saved the movie, that Spielberg had delivered kind of a dud, and that it was only Verner Fields' expertise that really got it going again. And Spielberg's complaint was that he felt like in a lot of interviews, Verna didn't do enough to sort of dissuade people from thinking that, and so supposedly he decided he didn't want to work with her. Although the interesting part is her son Rick, who I also talked to for the book, he was Spielberg's personal assistant on Jaws, and then he was his personal assistant on Close Encounters. So if there was bad blood, he still kept the sun on. So I have a feeling that story's been blown a little bit out of proportion. I'm sure there were probably some tensions there, but I think that maybe people try to make a little more out of it than maybe there really was, you know.
I think you're probably right, and I guess it was, as they say, all's well that ends well, since he wound up collaborating with Michael Kahn for all these many films that they've worked together on, and they seem to be a really, really good fit as far as...
He cut every Spielberg movie after that except for E.T. That's the only one he didn't edit. Everything else, it's been Michael Kahn and John Williams the whole way, you know.
That's amazing. It really is when you think about it. And we'll just wrap it up here and talk a little bit about the special edition. We can't we can't go without mentioning that, because that was unprecedented at the time. I don't think that had ever been attempted. So.
Well, Spielberg wanted to. They always re-released the movie in those days. That movie would come out about a year and a half later. It would get a re-release. Then it would go to TV. And Spielberg had been unhappy with some of the editing in the original version, and plus there were some scenes there was always a scene in the script where they discovered a ship in the desert that had been dropped there by UFOs, and they never filmed it because of budgetary reasons. And he really wanted to film that sequence, so they made a deal with Columbia to finance additional shooting, and basically the two big scenes where they put in the scene with the ship in the desert. They did some re-editing. They took out some things. They put in some things that had been shot originally but not included. And then, they wanted to take you inside the mothership. Now, there's always been a little bit of a weird rumor about that. Spielberg has stated on a number of occasions that Columbia basically told him, We'll do your reshoots and your re-edit. We'll finance it, but you need to give us more of the mothership, so you need to take us inside. I've actually heard from different people that Spielberg really loved that idea. He's sort of distanced himself from it now because it didn't actually turn out very well. But so they re-brought in the special effects guys. Trumbull and Yursich did not work on that sequence, but Bob Schwartz supervised that sequence where they go inside the mothership. So the movie was re-edited, these new scenes were put in, and it was re-released in the summer of 1980. And it did well. It didn't do spectacularly well. Some reviewers loved it, some did not. I'm one of the people who prefers the original release cut to the special edition. I don't think we're going inside the mothership worked. I don't think anybody in the end really thought it worked. And Spielberg actually did a second special edition in 1997, and that has a couple of different names, but the one that it's mostly known by is the Ultimate Director's Cut. And that's basically the re-edit from the special edition with some of the new footage cut in, but the trip inside the mothership was dropped, and Spielberg has made funny comments about it, and you will never see it again. So it's all gone. So, yeah, there were actually two special editions of Close Encounter. Believe it or not.
I totally agree with you on the inclusion of the interior of the mothership, because when I was a kid, I was so excited about the prospect of seeing that. But as an adult watching it, when you see it, it just ruins the entire editorial flow of the final act of the film. It's almost like the film just comes to a complete standstill while you're sitting there, while the camera just goes, gives you the inside view of the ship. And then the movie picks back up, but by that time, it's almost broken its spell, unfortunately, for me. Yeah. And that's the problem I had with it.
I agree, and I think Michael Phillips said a funny thing. He said, everybody thought that we wanted to see the inside of the mothership. Turns out we didn't want to see the inside of the mothership, as it went out. I agree with you. I think it interrupts the flow. The other thing, it creates a very strange thing in some people's mind, because if you recall that scene, basically, Richard Dreyfuss goes up and he looks up, and the joke, some people call it, he looks up at the lobby of the Hyatt Hotel. That's kind of what they felt it looked like a little bit. And it ends with a sort of an explosion of I can only call it fairy dust that comes sprinkling down. And then the next shot is the Carlo Rambaldi puck alien coming out of the ship to to give the hand-signed farewell to Francois Truffaut, there are many people who, the way that scene is edited, think that that's Richard Dreyfuss, who has been transformed by this fairy dust. That was nobody's intention making the movie, but I actually understand why people think that, because if you're reading it a certain way, it looks like that. But your point is totally correct, which is none of that, all of that just gets in the way of the wonderful transcendence of the original sequence. And Spielberg put that sequence back when the Ultimate Director's Cut came out, and that's the one that you'll see now if you see the film on home video or in a theater.
Yeah, and I think that's the best way to go about it, because it's much tighter, but it doesn't include the unnecessary stuff as well. So it's I think that is the preferred version, and I also remember seeing that in the special edition, maybe I'm correct. I might be incorrect about this. That they wanted to include more of the "When You Wish Upon a Star" in the John Williams score.
Yeah, in Spielberg's original draft of the script, and in every draft of the screenplay, he had indicated "When You Wish Upon a Star." He wanted to use it at the end of the movie. And in the original preview of the film, they did a preview in September of 1977 in Dallas. They had the actual song from Pinocchio. They actually tracked in the Ukulele Eye song. And apparently it got a very mixed reaction. And I think the feeling was that it was probably, like Spielberg said, that was the hook he hung the movie on. That's what inspired him and gave him the structure. But when they actually put the song in the movie, it was almost too literal, was sort of, I think, the feeling. So they took it out, and John Williams put a little bit of it in his score. Like right when Richard Dreyfuss is going up into the Mothership, you hear a little trace of "When You Wish Upon a Star," which I think it just touches on it, and it's kind of beautiful. When they did the special edition, they didn't change the movie score, but in the end of when the credits are rolling, originally after the main music concludes, there was sort of a reprise of John Williams' chase music, and they took that out and they put in an instrumental version of "When You Wish Upon a Star," and that was in the special edition. And I think that's a better idea than the actual song itself, though it's still almost maybe too much. My big complaint, besides some editorial choices and the inside of the mothership of the special edition versus the original edition, is the original edition is very subtle. The special edition is less subtle in a number of different ways. And I love the rendition of "When You Wish Upon a Star," but I think it may be too much. And when he went back to do the ultimate cut, he took "When You Wish Upon a Star" out and replaced it with the original end music, though it is on the soundtrack album for the Ultimate Director's Cut. The soundtrack album ends with "When You Wish Upon a Star." The movie ends with John Williams' chase music. So he got it both ways, I guess. You know.
Yeah. So yeah, I just thought that was worthy of mentioning, because they did pay quite a bit of money, I think, for the use of that. So that was quite. It wasn't something that came cheaply, or that they did, you know. But well, listen, this has really been great. We appreciate you taking the time to give us a little insight into the creation of this great science fiction film that we both love and many other people love as well. And again, I want to reiterate your book, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, The Making of Steven Spielberg's Classic Film. That's available wherever you get your books, and especially at Amazon, of course. And you can go right on there. And I highly recommend anybody who's listening who's a big fan of this film, or maybe just a casual fan, to get this book, because it's a tremendously well-researched and detailed look at the production of a major Hollywood film in the pre-CGI days. And do you have anything else you're working on? I'll let you tell us about it if you have something.
A couple of things. I can't really talk about them right now, but kind of along the same lines. I'm hoping to do the same thing with another movie that I think, if you like Close Encounters, hopefully you'll like the movie that I'm researching now. But that's all I can say at the moment. But try to keep at it.